As the surgeon performed the operation on the unassuming woman, a sudden jolt of shock paralyzed him. His eyes locked onto a birthmark on her body, the very same one his daughter had, the one that had haunted him ever since she vanished 18 years ago. Dr. Mitchell Lawson hovered over the operating table, his hand steady and poised as he concentrated on the delicate task at hand. With years of experience under his belt, he was able to block out distractions and immerse himself fully in saving lives. Yet today was different. His usually sharp, focused mind stumbled for a brief second as he adjusted his position. The patient, a young woman named Grace, had been brought in after a serious car accident. She had sustained multiple injuries, including internal bleeding. The case was tricky, but Mitchell had dealt with far worse. However, as he prepared to make an incision, something caught his eye. An unmistakable crescent-shaped birthmark on the side of her rib cage. For a fleeting moment, his breath caught in his throat. His pulse raced as his gaze lingered on the mark, frozen for what seemed like an eternity, though it lasted only a few seconds. That mark, he knew it well. It was the same as his daughter Emma's, the daughter who had mysteriously disappeared 18 years ago. Mitchell's thoughts were interrupted by the assisting nurse's voice, snapping him back to the present. Blinking rapidly, Mitchell's mind raced in disbelief. It couldn't be her. He quickly shook his head, trying to regain focus on the surgery. Grace was depending on him to remain sharp, not to get lost in a sea of painful memories. He pushed the unsettling thought to the back of his mind and completed the surgery with the precision that had earned him his reputation. But even as his hands moved through the familiar motions, the image of that birthmark lingered. It was impossible to shake off. His heart ached as memories from the day Emma disappeared flooded back. The endless search, the sleepless nights spent drowning in guilt and grief. His wife had tragically died during childbirth, and he had promised to protect their daughter Emma with every ounce of his being. But in one cruel moment she was gone. As the surgery came to an end, Mitchell removed his gloves and stepped away from the operating room. His colleagues offered their congratulations, but their words barely registered. He was too consumed with questions. Who was this woman? Why did she share the same birthmark as Emma? He stood by the glass window watching Grace as she lay unconscious, her chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm. She looked serene, unaware of the emotional turmoil her presence had sparked in him. A strange, inexplicable connection to her formed in his mind, something deeper than the usual concern he felt for his patients. After what felt like hours, Mitchell reluctantly turned away, his mind a whirlwind. He needed to uncover more about Grace, her background, her family. But asking her directly wasn't an option. Not without arousing suspicion. And then there was Diane to think about. His wife, the woman who had stood by him through the aftermath of Emma's disappearance. Together they had rebuilt their lives, though the void left by Emma's absence had never truly been filled. How could he tell Diane about what he'd just seen? How could he explain that today something had happened that made him question everything? Mitchell walked down the sterile hospital corridor, his footsteps echoing. When he reached his office, he closed the door behind him and slumped into his chair. His hands pressed against his temples as he tried to gather his scattered thoughts. He couldn't jump to conclusions, but that birthmark, it was too striking, too similar to ignore. How could it be just a coincidence? He leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling as the weight of the question sank in. What were the odds? After all this time, could it really be her? If Grace was indeed Emma, how had she survived? Where had she been all these years? And why hadn't she come back to him? There was only one way to find out. Mitchell made up his mind then and there. He would investigate, carefully, discreetly. He would dig into Grace's past and uncover the truth. If, by some miracle, she turned out to be the daughter he had lost so long ago, the implications would be profound. The thought of it sent a chill down his spine. If it were true, if this woman was Emma, Mitchell would have to face the ghosts of the past. Confronting the pain of his daughter's disappearance meant not only revisiting his own sorrow, but also risking the life he had built with Diane. Was he prepared for that? Mitchell exhaled slowly, trying to compose himself. He wasn't sure where this path would lead, but he knew he had to follow it. The truth had to come out. For now, he would wait for Grace to recover. Once she was stable, he would begin his search for answers. As he left his office, the hospital buzzed with activity, doctors and nurses hurrying about. But for Mitchell, everything had changed. That small crescent-shaped birthmark had unlocked a chapter of his life he had thought was closed forever. Sitting in his car in the hospital parking lot, Mitchell gripped the steering wheel tightly, overwhelmed by the memories that flooded back. The sight of Grace on the operating table, her birthmark visible under the surgical lights, had stirred emotions he had worked so hard to bury. It was impossible to see that mark and not think of Emma. He remembered the years he spent searching for her after she vanished, hiring private investigators, contacting the police again and again, and putting out missing persons reports. He had searched shelters, hospitals, and orphanages, hoping, praying that one day she would be found. But as the years wore on, hope began to fade, and the pain of Emma's disappearance never truly left. It clung to him like a shadow, darkening even the brightest moments of his life. When he had lost his wife during childbirth, he thought nothing could hurt more. But losing Emma had shattered him in ways he never thought possible. Through all of it, Diane had been there, a constant source of comfort. They had met not long after Emma's disappearance when Mitchell was at his lowest, struggling to balance his grief with the demands of his work. Diane, a friend of a colleague, had stepped in with kindness, offering him the support he desperately needed. Slowly, they built a life together. A life filled with quiet moments of peace that softened the sharp pain, even though it would never truly disappear. Now all those old feelings were resurfacing. The memory of Emma's laugh, her endless curiosity, and the way she would tug at his hand to show him something new. All of it rushed back in an instant. He could still hear her calling out to him, "Daddy?" Her favorite stuffed bunny clutched tightly in her arms as she waited for him to come home after long shifts at the hospital. And then one day she was simply gone. Mitchell squeezed his eyes shut, trying to block out the memory of that horrific day. The panic that gripped him when he realized Emma was no longer in her room. The frantic search throughout the house. The rising sense of dread that soon transformed into a chilling, icy fear as the hours stretched on with no sign of her. He vividly recalled Diane arriving, trying to comfort him while the authorities combed through every inch of the neighborhood. Back then, Diane had been his pillar, the one who kept him grounded when everything else seemed to be falling apart. But now, sitting in his car, Mitchell couldn't shake the feeling that something about the situation didn't quite add up. He had never questioned Diane's support during that time, nor had he ever considered that she could be in any way connected to Emma's disappearance. Why would he? Diane had been his savior, offering love and stability when his world was crumbling. Yet now, after seeing Grace, doubts began to creep in. Was it possible that Diane had known something all along? Had she hidden something from him? No, he thought, shaking his head in disbelief. That couldn't be right. Diane had been just as devastated by Emma's disappearance as he had. He couldn't let his mind wander down that dark path. Not yet. He started the car and drove home, attempting to steady himself as he pulled into the driveway. He noticed the lights were on inside. Diane was waiting for him, just as she always did when he worked late. The familiar comfort of their home should have been reassuring, but now everything felt out of sync. Mitchell wasn't sure if it was the exhaustion from the long day or the emotional storm he had just weathered, but something about coming home to Diane felt different. He stepped inside and the scent of her cooking filled the air. Diane was in the kitchen, humming softly to herself as she prepared dinner. When she looked up and saw him, her smile was warm, her expression full of love. Mitchell managed a smile in return, though his heart was weighed down by the heavy burden of the past. "How was your day?" she asked, wiping her hands on a dish towel as she walked over to him. "It was eventful," he replied, his voice quieter than usual. He kissed her on the cheek, but it felt almost automatic, as if he were merely going through the motions. Diane seemed to notice something was off but didn't push him. "You look tired. Why don't we sit down and I'll bring dinner over?" she suggested, gesturing to the dining table. Mitchell nodded, thankful for the distraction of a meal, though his appetite had all but disappeared. As they ate, a heavy silence hung between them. His thoughts kept returning to Grace, to Emma, and to that birthmark. He needed answers, but he couldn't share his concerns with Diane, not yet. He had to be certain first. That night, as they lay in bed, Mitchell stared at the ceiling, unable to sleep. Diane was already deeply asleep beside him, her breathing soft and steady. But for Mitchell, sleep was impossible. The images of Emma, of Grace, and everything he stood to either lose or regain swirled in his mind. Something had changed. The ghosts of his past had returned to haunt him, and deep down, Mitchell knew that nothing would ever be the same again. The next morning, Mitchell awoke, staring at the ceiling, sleep having barely touched him. His mind raced with thoughts of Grace, Emma, the birthmark, the uncanny resemblance, the timing. Too much for it all to be coincidence. But what if he was wrong? What if this was just wishful thinking? His heart holding on to the hope that Emma was still out there, alive? Mitchell quietly slid out of bed, careful not to wake Diane, who was still asleep beside him. He moved through the house like a man on autopilot, his thoughts distant as he made a cup of coffee and sat at the kitchen table, staring blankly out the window. He knew he had to act. He couldn't just wait for answers to fall into his lap. The idea of going to Grace directly crossed his mind, but he quickly dismissed it. He had to be careful. He didn't want to scare her or make her feel uncomfortable. What could he possibly say? "Hi, I'm Dr. Mitchell Lawson, and I think you might be my long-lost daughter?" No, that wouldn't work. He needed a strategy. After finishing his coffee, Mitchell got dressed and headed to the hospital earlier than usual. He wasn't scheduled to work, but today he had a reason for going in. He needed to learn more about Grace, to figure out where she came from, and whether there was any link to Emma's disappearance. His pulse quickened as he approached the hospital. He made his way to the records department, his mind racing with the possibility of finding answers. He needed to access Grace's file, but he had to do it discreetly. He didn't want anyone to question why he was looking into her past. Fortunately, his position as a senior surgeon gave him the access he needed without raising too many eyebrows. Mitchell grabbed Grace's file and retreated to his office, closing the door behind him. He flipped through the pages, desperate for any clue that could shed light on who Grace truly was. The file was slim as expected. It revealed that Grace had been abandoned as a child and placed in foster care when she was around 3 years old. There were no records of her birth parents, no indication of where she had come from. It was as though she had appeared out of nowhere, with no history to speak of. Mitchell's heart raced as he scanned the documents. Could it be that Grace had been taken from him all those years ago and ended up in the foster system? Her true identity a mystery? The timeline matched. Grace was the right age, but still there were gaps in the story. He needed more. He leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples as he tried to put the pieces together. The birthmark, the timing, the fact that Grace had no memory of her early years. It all pointed in one direction, but without concrete evidence, he couldn't be certain. He needed to dig deeper. Just as he was lost in thought, a knock on the door startled him. He quickly closed the file and looked up as Diane entered. Her face wore an expression of concern, mixed with curiosity. "You're in early," she said, smiling as she walked toward him. "I thought you had the morning off." "I did," Mitchell replied, trying to sound casual. "I just had some paperwork to catch up on." Diane glanced around the room, her eyes briefly settling on the file he had just hidden. Mitchell's heart skipped a beat, but he forced a smile, trying to remain calm. "Everything okay?" she asked, her tone light but probing. "Yeah, just busy," Mitchell said, standing up from his desk. "I've been doing a lot of thinking about work. Just trying to keep my focus," Mitchell said, his voice soft. Diane nodded, though there was still a hint of suspicion in her gaze. "Well, don't push yourself too hard. We've both been through a lot," she replied. Her words hung between them, a subtle reminder of the shared pain they both carried from Emma's disappearance. For a fleeting moment, Mitchell felt a sharp pang of guilt. Diane had always been his rock during the darkest times. He had never wanted to hurt her, but the gnawing feeling that something was off about the whole situation was becoming impossible to ignore. "I know," he said quietly, placing a hand on her shoulder. "I'm just trying to make sense of it all." Diane smiled, though her eyes didn't quite reflect the warmth of her expression. "I understand. Just don't lose yourself in it, okay?" Mitchell nodded, watching her leave his office. As the door clicked shut behind her, he let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He needed to be more cautious. Diane was starting to sense that something was wrong, and he couldn't afford to give her any clues just yet. Not until he was absolutely certain. Once she was gone, Mitchell returned to the file, but deep down, he knew it wouldn't provide the answers he was desperately seeking. If he wanted to uncover the truth about Grace, he needed help from someone who specialized in investigations. That afternoon, Mitchell called an old acquaintance, a private investigator he had worked with during the initial search for Emma. If anyone could uncover the missing pieces of Grace's past, it was him. Mitchell wasn't ready to confront Grace or Diane with his suspicions just yet, but he knew he had to keep searching. The truth couldn't stay hidden forever. Over the next few days, Mitchell's routine remained mostly the same. He continued to perform his duties at the hospital with his usual precision, but his thoughts were never far from Grace. He found himself visiting her room more often than necessary, checking in on her recovery each time. Every time he stood by her bedside, watching her slowly regain her strength, he felt a pull toward her. It was no longer just curiosity. It was something deeper, something that stirred paternal instincts he hadn't expected. Grace, completely unaware of the emotional turmoil her doctor was going through, was making good progress. Her injuries had been severe, but she was strong, and her determination to heal was evident. Mitchell saw so much of Emma in her, the quiet strength, the unspoken resilience, the way she carried herself even through pain. It all tugged at his heart. One afternoon, after finishing his rounds, Mitchell walked into Grace's room. She was sitting up in bed, flipping through a magazine. When she saw him, she looked up and offered a small smile. "Dr. Lawson," she greeted him, her voice still a bit weak but steady. "I was wondering when you'd come by." Mitchell smiled back, trying to keep his emotions in check. "How are you feeling today, Grace?" "Better," she replied, setting the magazine down. "Still sore, but I can tell I'm healing." "Good," Mitchell said, glancing at her chart. "You're making great progress." There was a brief pause before Grace looked at him with a curious expression. "You've been checking on me a lot, haven't you?" Mitchell's heart skipped a beat. Had she noticed? He kept his tone light, shrugging it off. "Just doing my job. I like to make sure my patients are well taken care of." Grace nodded, but there was a flicker of something in her eyes that suggested she wasn't entirely convinced. "I appreciate it," she said quietly. "I don't have many people looking out for me." The words hit Mitchell harder than he expected. His chest tightened as he thought about how different everything could have been if Emma had grown up with him. He had spent years imagining their life together, the way he would have protected her, cared for her, and been there for every moment. And now here was Grace, a woman who could very well be his lost daughter, saying she had no one watching over her. "Well, you have people now," Mitchell said softly, his eyes meeting hers. "You're not alone." Grace looked at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then slowly she smiled again. This time the smile reached her eyes. "Thank you," she said, her voice sincere. "That means more than you know." Mitchell nodded, feeling a rush of emotion that he had to fight to suppress. He wanted to tell her everything, to explain why he felt such a deep connection to her. But he knew it wasn't the right time. Not yet. He needed to wait for the private investigator's findings. Only then would he know for sure if Grace was really Emma. Over the next few days, Mitchell continued to visit Grace regularly. Their conversations grew longer and more personal. She shared more about her life, how she had grown up in foster care, raised by a loving family who, while they had done their best, couldn't afford to search for her birth parents. Grace had always known she was adopted, but she didn't remember anything from before the age of 3. Her foster parents had given her a happy childhood, but she admitted that there had always been a sense of something missing, a void she couldn't explain. As Mitchell listened to her, his heart ached. The more Grace spoke, the more certain he became that she was Emma. The timeline matched, the circumstances lined up, and the birthmark was undeniable. But he still needed proof. One afternoon, while Grace was telling him about her dreams of going back to school once she recovered, Mitchell's phone buzzed in his pocket. It was a message from the private investigator. "He's got something. Let's meet." Mitchell's pulse quickened. This was it, the moment he had been waiting for. He stood up, trying to hide his sudden surge of anticipation. "I'm glad to hear you're planning to go back to school," he said, forcing a smile at Grace. "I'll check in on you later, okay?" Grace nodded, though her brow furrowed slightly. "Thanks, Dr. Lawson." Mitchell hurried out of the room, his heart racing. He had to know what the investigator had found. The drive to the meeting point felt like an eternity, his mind spinning with possibilities. When he arrived at the small cafe where they had agreed to meet, the investigator was already there. "You found something?" Mitchell asked, his voice tense as soon as he sat down. The investigator nodded, sliding a folder across the table. "You're not going to believe this." Mitchell opened the folder and quickly scanned the documents inside. His breath caught in his throat as he read about a missing child case that matched Emma's description. The child had been found and placed in the foster system, but the records had been sealed for years due to a clerical error. "It's her," the investigator confirmed. "Grace is Emma." Mitchell leaned back in his chair, the weight of the revelation crashing over him. It was real. Grace was his daughter. Emma had been alive all this time, living a life he knew nothing about. And now, after 18 long years, they were on the verge of being reunited. But with that revelation came a flood of overwhelming questions. What now? Mitchell sat in his car outside the cafe, staring at the folder on the passenger seat. The evidence was undeniable. Grace, was she really Emma? After all these years, after endless sleepless nights and prayers, he had finally found her. But instead of the joy he should have felt, an overwhelming sense of dread settled over him. What now? Mitchell's mind was reeling. How could he tell Grace the truth without completely shattering her world? And what about Diane? He couldn't ignore the fact that Grace had no recollection of her life before she was found. She had lived her entire life believing she was someone else, someone with no ties to her past, or him. Revealing the truth now could dismantle everything she knew about herself. And Mitchell wasn't sure he was ready to face the consequences of that. He took a deep breath, cranked the engine, and made his way back to the hospital. His fingers gripped the steering wheel, knuckles white as his thoughts spiraled. He couldn't keep this to himself forever. Grace had a right to know. But how could he do it without pushing her away? And what if, after hearing the truth, she wanted nothing to do with him? Pulling into the hospital parking lot, his phone buzzed in his pocket. He checked it quickly. Another message from Diane. "Are you coming home soon? Dinner at 7. Mitchell let out a heavy sigh. The burden of the secret felt even heavier now. Diane had been patient with him, sensing that something was off, but he hadn't told her a word about Grace, or the birthmark, or the investigation. How could he? Diane had been his support through the worst of his grief, helping him pick up the pieces after Emma's disappearance. But now everything was on the verge of changing. He stepped out of the car, his legs feeling heavier with each step. As he made his way back into the hospital, all he could think about was the time he needed. He needed time to figure out how to tell Grace and how to tell Diane. He needed time to process the flood of emotions that had taken over him. Entering his office, he closed the door behind him, the sound of the click echoing in the silence. He collapsed into his chair, feeling the weight of the decision ahead of him. Could he really confront Diane with all this? The thought of it made his chest tighten. He loved her, but now that Emma was back in his life, the emptiness he'd felt for so long was almost unbearable. Just as his thoughts began to swirl again, a gentle knock on the door interrupted him. The door creaked open and Diane stepped inside, her warm expression tinged with concern. "Late again, huh?" she said as she closed the door behind her. "I thought you'd be home earlier tonight." Mitchell sat up, forcing himself to seem composed. "Yeah, sorry. It's been a long day." Diane walked over to him, her eyes studying his face. "You've been off lately. What's going on?" Mitchell's heart pounded in his chest, a familiar anxiety building. He couldn't keep this from her. He had to say something. Maybe not everything, but enough to ease her worry. "It's just work," he said, forcing a smile. "I've had a lot to think about." Diane didn't buy it. She sat down across from him, brow furrowed with concern. "Mitchell, I know when something's wrong. You don't have to hide it from me." For a moment, Mitchell considered confessing everything right then, but the words stuck in his throat. He wasn't ready, not yet. Not until he had a better sense of where things were headed. Instead, he reached for her hand, his voice soft. "I know," he said, his gaze meeting hers. "I'm just trying to sort through a few things. I'll be fine." Diane squeezed his hand gently, her eyes softening. "You don't have to go through it alone. I'm here for you. I always have been." Mitchell nodded, his chest tightening at the sincerity in her voice. She meant it, but the secret he was carrying felt like a wall between them. How could he open up to her when everything he thought he knew was on the brink of unraveling? After a long silent moment, Diane stood, offering him a small smile. "Don't stay too late, okay? I'll see you at home." Mitchell watched her leave, the door closing quietly behind her. He leaned back in his chair, a long breath escaping his lips. His mind raced. He had a daughter alive and well, but she didn't know him. Soon he would have to tell Diane everything, and somehow he wasn't sure he could. Later, as Mitchell drove home, his phone buzzed again. This time it wasn't Diane, it was the private investigator. "I've dug deeper into Grace's background. There's something else you need to know." Mitchell's heart skipped a beat. What now? He had thought he was ready for whatever might come, but something in the message unsettled him. He quickly typed a response, agreeing to meet the investigator the following day. His search for answers was inching closer, but with every new revelation, the fear of what he might find grew stronger. Mitchell pulled into the driveway, the weight of the day pressing down on him. Tomorrow, he'd meet the investigator again. Tomorrow everything might change again. But tonight, as he stepped inside to join Diane for dinner, he couldn't shake the feeling that the calm before the storm was almost over. The next morning, Mitchell sat in the same cafe, his hands restless as he waited for the private investigator. His coffee sat untouched, the steam evaporating into the air as his mind raced with the possibilities. The investigator's message from the night before had rattled him, and the apprehension built with every passing minute. Finally, the door to the cafe opened, and the investigator stepped inside, his movements slow but deliberate. Mitchell's pulse quickened. This was it, the moment he had been dreading and anticipating all at once. "Morning," the investigator said, taking a seat and sliding a folder across the table. "You're not going to like this," he warned. Mitchell's throat tightened. "What is it?" The investigator exhaled, leaning forward slightly. "I dug deeper into Grace's past like you asked. The foster system didn't have much on her early years, but I managed to uncover something that wasn't in the official reports." Mitchell's hand hovered over the folder, his heart pounding. "What did you find?" The investigator folded his hands together. "Grace wasn't just abandoned. There are sealed records, ones that suggest she was deliberately hidden. The people who found her didn't stumble upon her by chance." Mitchell sat frozen, trying to process the investigator's words. They were part of something much bigger. Someone had gone to great lengths to ensure that Grace, Emma, disappeared. He could feel the weight of the words sinking in. His throat tightened. "Who?" He barely managed to whisper. The investigator's eyes locked onto his, cold and steady. "And that's the part you're not going to like. I can't say for sure, but all signs point to someone close to you." Mitchell's mind went blank. Someone close to him? The idea that anyone in his life could be involved in something so dark was incomprehensible. "What do you mean? Someone orchestrated this?" His voice quivered with disbelief. The investigator nodded. "The records show inconsistencies that suggest this wasn't a random abduction. It looks planned, organized." Mitchell's heart pounded in his chest, his thoughts spiraling. Someone close to him? Could it be? Could it really be someone he trusted, someone he loved? His thoughts jumped to Diane. No, it couldn't be her. She had been by his side through the worst of it. A pillar of strength, a source of comfort. The idea that she could have been involved in such a monstrous act was beyond his understanding. But as the investigator's words lingered in the air, the seed of doubt began to take root. Mitchell's hands trembled slightly as he opened the folder, revealing more documents, photographs, reports, and a detailed timeline of Grace's life before she was placed in foster care. With each page he turned, his stomach dropped further. The evidence stacked up, indisputable, overwhelming. Whoever had hidden Grace had made sure to cover their tracks. And that person had to be someone who had access to his life, someone he trusted completely. The investigator spoke again, his voice low and deliberate. "Mitchell, I don't have solid proof yet, but the timeline matches up with the time you and Diane met. There are gaps in her story that align with the events surrounding Grace's disappearance." Mitchell leaned back in his chair, his thoughts a chaotic mess. The ground beneath him felt as though it was slipping away. Could Diane really be involved in Emma's disappearance? The woman who had been his anchor, his constant through every heartbreaking moment, could she really have been the one to take his daughter from him? "I need time to process this," Mitchell stammered, his voice shaking. The investigator nodded without speaking, understanding the weight of what he was saying. "Take all the time you need," he said quietly. "But remember, if this is true, you need to confront it head-on. Grace deserves to know the truth." Mitchell could barely hear the investigator's words over the roar of his own thoughts. His entire life had been built on a foundation of lies. How much of it had been a lie? How much of what he thought he knew was real? He thanked the investigator, his voice distant, and left the cafe in a daze. He walked to his car, each step feeling like he was moving through quicksand. When he finally slid into the driver's seat and gripped the steering wheel, the weight of the truth settled in, suffocating him. Diane had been there for him through everything. She had helped him heal after Emma's disappearance. How could she possibly have been involved in something so monstrous? But the evidence, it couldn't be ignored. He drove back to the hospital, each minute on the road feeling like an eternity. When he finally arrived, it was late. He wasn't ready to face Diane, not yet. Not until he could sort through the chaos in his head. Instead, he went straight to Grace's room. He needed to see her to remind himself of what he was fighting for. Grace was sitting up in bed, looking much better. She smiled when she saw him. "Dr. Lawson," she greeted him, her voice a bit stronger. "You're back." Mitchell forced a smile, but his mind was elsewhere. "How are you feeling today?" he asked, trying to mask the turmoil inside. "Better," she said, her eyes brightening. "I think I might be ready to leave soon." Mitchell nodded, though his heart was heavy. "That's great news." But there was a pause, and Mitchell noticed Grace watching him, her expression shifting from lighthearted to concerned. "You seem off. Is everything okay?" she asked, her voice gentle but insistent. Mitchell hesitated, his chest tightening. Could he tell her? Could he share all that he had learned, when he didn't even know how to handle it himself? Grace, Emma, deserved to know, but how could he burden her with this when he wasn't sure what it all meant? "I'm fine," he lied, his voice low. "Just a lot on my mind." Grace didn't press him further, but the look in her eyes told him she wasn't convinced. She knew something was wrong. They talked for a while longer, mostly about her recovery, but Mitchell's mind was elsewhere. His heart felt heavier than ever as he left the room. The truth was coming for him, and no matter how much he tried to outrun it, it was catching up. The house felt eerily quiet when Mitchell stepped inside later that evening. Normally, the warmth of home would have been a comfort, but tonight it felt foreign, unsettling. The usual sounds, Diane bustling in the kitchen, the hum of the refrigerator, felt like they were closing in on him. His thoughts were consumed with the investigator's findings. Could Diane really have been involved in Emma's disappearance? How could the woman he'd shared his life with for years be hiding something so monstrous? He closed the door behind him, his mind in turmoil. The sound of dishes clinking in the kitchen told him Diane was preparing dinner, just as she always did. But tonight, everything felt different. Every little noise, every motion she made, seemed loaded with suspicion. Mitchell stood frozen in the entryway for a long moment. Could he confront her? Or would he retreat into the silence, pretending like nothing was wrong? But he knew he couldn't keep quiet any longer. He had to know the truth, no matter how painful it might be. With a deep breath, he walked toward the kitchen. Diane stood at the stove, stirring a pot of soup. She looked up as he entered, offering him the same warm smile she always did. But tonight it didn't comfort him. Tonight, all he could see was the potential betrayal behind her familiar face. "You're home late," Diane said lightly, turning off the stove. "Dinner's almost ready." Mitchell didn't respond right away. He stood there, his eyes locked on her, searching for something, anything, that could explain what he was beginning to suspect. How had he missed it all? Or had there been nothing to miss? Had Diane been so careful, so good at hiding the truth, that he never once questioned her? Swallowing hard, he finally broke the silence. "Diane, we need to talk." Diane set the spoon down and turned, her smile faltering as she noticed the seriousness in his voice. Her brow furrowed with concern. "What's wrong? Did something happen at the hospital?" Mitchell shook his head, his heart hammering in his chest. He felt like he was standing on the edge of a precipice, ready to step into an abyss. Could he handle what he was about to hear? "No, it's not the hospital," Mitchell said softly, his voice trembling. "It's about Emma." Diane's expression shifted, just for a moment. her eyes betraying something before she quickly masked it with feigned confusion. "Emma? Why are you bringing her up now?" she asked, her voice wavering. Mitchell stepped closer, his gaze locked on hers. "Because I know the truth, Diane. I know what happened to her." The kitchen, once alive with the sounds of cooking, fell into an eerie silence. Diane stood frozen, her breath catching. She stared at him, eyes wide with fear. "I don't know what you're talking about," she stammered, her voice shaky, but Mitchell could see the cracks in her facade. He had known this woman for years, loved her, trusted her. And now, standing before him, he could see the guilt, the fear bubbling beneath her attempts to remain calm. "Stop lying to me," he said, his voice rising despite his best efforts to remain composed. "I know you were involved in Emma's disappearance. I know you took her from me." Diane took an instinctive step back, her eyes widening in shock. "Mitchell, what are you talking about? How can you say something like that?" "Because I've been investigating," Mitchell pressed, his heart pounding in his chest. "I hired a private investigator. He found the records, the evidence. Grace, she's Emma. Our Emma. And you knew, didn't you?" Diane's face drained of color. Her hands trembled as she leaned against the counter for support, struggling to hold herself together. For what felt like an eternity, she said nothing, the weight of the accusation hanging between them. Finally, her voice came, barely above a whisper. "I did it for us, Mitchell." Mitchell's stomach dropped. The room felt as though the air had been sucked out of it. His world, once stable and certain, seemed to tilt, spinning out of control. He had braced himself for a denial, maybe even anger, but not this. Not the admission of guilt. "You did what?" he asked, his voice cracking. Diane's eyes welled with tears as she looked at him, her voice shaking. "I couldn't lose you, Mitchell. After Emma was born. After everything we went through, I knew how much you loved her. I knew I could never compete with that. You would always put her first, and I—" She broke off, her hands covering her face as sobs racked her body. Mitchell stood there, stunned, frozen. The pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. The woman he had trusted, the one he had built a life with, had stolen his daughter, out of jealousy. She had orchestrated the entire thing, taken Emma from him because she wanted him all to herself. "How could you do this?" Mitchell whispered, his voice barely audible, heavy with the weight of grief. "How could you take my daughter from me?" Diane collapsed to the floor, sobbing uncontrollably. The guilt she had carried for years was now breaking free, flooding the room. "I'm sorry," she choked out. I thought it would bring us closer. I never meant for it to go this far. But once it started, I couldn't stop it," she continued, her words barely comprehensible through the tears. Mitchell's hand shook as he watched her, his heart shattered into pieces. "You destroyed everything," he said, his voice raw with pain. "You took her from me. From us. You lied to me for all these years." Diane looked up at him, her eyes red and swollen from crying. "Please, Mitchell. I never wanted this. I love you. I thought I was doing the right thing. Please." But Mitchell couldn't listen to her anymore. The betrayal was too much. The pain too deep. Without another word, he turned and walked out of the kitchen, leaving Diane sobbing on the floor. He needed to get out. He needed to breathe. The cool night air hit him as he stepped outside. He felt like he was suffocating, drowning in the enormity of the truth. The confession had torn apart everything he thought he knew. Mitchell drove aimlessly, the quiet streets blurring past him. His mind was a whirlwind. Anger, disbelief, betrayal. Each feeling crashed over him like waves, pulling him deeper into the abyss. The woman he had trusted, the woman who had been by his side through every moment of grief and loss, had been the one to take Emma away. How could she have done this? How could she have lived with that secret for so long, watching him grieve, watching him search for their daughter, all while knowing she had orchestrated it all? Mitchell's grip on the steering wheel tightened, his knuckles white with tension. He couldn't understand it. He couldn't fathom how Diane had kept this from him. Finally, he pulled over to the side of the road. Turning off the engine, he sat in the silence, the weight of Diane's confession pressing down on him. He had spent years mourning the loss of Emma, and now everything he thought he knew had been shattered. Grace, Emma, had been right there, living a life he never knew about, a life taken from him by the person he trusted the most. Mitchell leaned his head against the steering wheel, his thoughts spinning in a chaotic mess. What was he supposed to do now? He had found Emma, but at what cost? How could he face her now, knowing the truth of what had been done to her? The hours seemed to stretch on as he sat there, the weight of his decisions pressing in on him. Every thought led to more questions, more pain. How could he tell Grace everything? And if he did, would she ever forgive him for the life she had lost? As the first light of dawn began to break, Mitchell made a decision. He couldn't keep this from Grace any longer. She deserved to know the truth. She deserved to understand who she really was and what had been taken from her. As much as it terrified him, as much as it pained him to think of her reaction, he knew he couldn't hide the truth forever. He started the car again, his mind made up. He would go to Grace. He would tell her everything. But even then he didn't know how she would react. Would she be relieved to know the truth, or devastated by the weight of it? When he arrived at the hospital, it was still early. The halls were quiet, nurses moving slowly about as the day began. Mitchell walked through the corridors, the weight of his decision pressing heavily on his shoulders. This was it. The truth would come out. And he didn't know what would happen next. Mitchell's heart raced as he approached Grace's room. He paused outside the door, taking a deep breath to steady himself before entering. Grace was sitting up in bed, flipping through a book. When she saw him, a smile spread across her face. "Dr. Lawson, you're here early," she said, her voice light and welcoming. Mitchell forced a smile, though the weight of the conversation he was about to have pressed heavily on his chest. "Yeah," he replied quietly, pulling up a chair beside her. "I need to talk to you." Grace's smile faltered slightly, a hint of concern flickering in her eyes. "Is everything okay?" Mitchell hesitated, his mind a whirlwind of thoughts. How do you tell someone that their whole life has been built on a lie? How do you explain that the people they've trusted have betrayed them in the most unimaginable way? "There's something I need to tell you," he started, his voice trembling. "Something important about your past." Grace frowned and set her book aside. "My past?" Mitchell nodded, his throat tight with the weight of the words he had to say. "You're not really Grace," he began softly, his voice thick with emotion. "Your real name is Emma. You're my daughter." The words hung in the air between them, heavy, surreal. Grace stared at him, blinking, her mouth slightly open, trying to process the impossibility of what he had just said. "Your daughter?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Mitchell nodded, his heart breaking at the look of confusion and fear in her eyes. 18 years ago you disappeared. You were taken from me. I've been searching for you ever since." Grace shook her head, her hands trembling as she gripped the edge of the blanket. "No, that can't be right. I don't remember any of that." "I know," Mitchell said softly, his voice thick with emotion. "You were just a baby when it happened. You wouldn't remember. But it's true. I've had tests done, I've looked into your past, everything points to one thing. You're Emma." Tears filled Grace's eyes as she stared at him, her mind reeling from the shock. Why didn't I know? Why didn't anyone tell me?" Mitchell swallowed hard, his own eyes stinging with unshared tears. "'Cause someone didn't want you to know. Someone close to me. My wife. Diane. She's the one who took you." Grace's face went pale, her breath catching in her throat. "Diane? The woman you're married to?" Mitchell nodded, the pain in his chest intensifying as he saw the devastation on her face. "She did it because she was afraid. She thought that if you were still in my life, I wouldn't be able to love her the way she wanted. She thought if she took you away we could be happy. But she was wrong. I was never whole without you." Grace's tears spilled over, her face crumpling in disbelief. No, that can't be true. That can't be." She shook her head as if trying to deny it all. "I'm so sorry," Mitchell whispered, his voice breaking. "I'm sorry for everything you've lost. For everything she's done. But I promise you I'll make it right. I'll do whatever it takes to make it right." Grace stared at him, tears streaming down her face, her world collapsing around her. Everything she thought she knew about her life, about the people she trusted, had been built on a lie. The life she had lived was nothing but an illusion. And now as she sat there, overwhelmed with grief and confusion, she wasn't sure how she would ever piece it all back together. She sat in stunned silence, the room around her seeming to blur. Mitchell's words echoed in her mind, each one cutting deeper than the last. "I'm Emma. I was taken from my father. My whole life was a lie. Her heart pounded in her chest as the enormity of the revelation sank in. The woman who had raised her, loved her, was the very person who had stolen her from the only family she ever knew. Diane, the woman she had trusted, was the reason for it all. She felt an overwhelming surge of emotion, a mix of anger, sadness, and betrayal. Tears kept falling, but they didn't stop the questions racing through her mind. Why didn't anyone look for me? Why didn't I know? Mitchell reached out, his hand hovering near hers, uncertain if she would allow him any comfort. I did look for you, he said, his voice thick with emotion. I searched everywhere for years. But Diane, she made sure you were hidden. She did everything in her power to keep you from me. Emma shook her head, her body trembling. But why? Why would she do this to us? Mitchell's eyes welled with tears as he looked at her. His pain was palpable, but there was a tenderness in his voice. She was afraid. She thought that if you were in my life, I wouldn't be able to love her the way she needed. She thought if you were gone we could be happy. But she was wrong. I was never whole without you. Emma's chest tightened as she tried to hold herself together. Her hands gripped the blanket tightly, as though physical strength might help her make sense of the chaos inside her. I don't even know who I am anymore, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Mitchell gently squeezed her hand, his voice soft but steady. You're my daughter. You're Emma. The girl I've loved and missed every single day for the last 18 years. That hasn't changed. Emma looked at him, her eyes filled with sorrow. But everything's changed, she whispered. My whole life. It's all been a lie. Mitchell's heart broke for her. He wished there was something he could do to undo the years of pain, to take away her grief. But all he could do now was be there for her, help her navigate this painful new reality. I know it feels like that right now, he said gently, but we'll figure this out. One step at a time. You're not alone in this, Emma. You have me. Emma wiped her eyes, trying to steady her breath. She wanted to believe him, to find solace in the fact that her real father was here offering her love and support. But the overwhelming sense of loss hung over her like a cloud. The years of her life that had been stolen, the truth that had been hidden from her. It was too much to bear. I don't even know what to feel right now, Emma whispered, her voice shaky as she tried to make sense of everything. I'm angry, Emma whispered, her voice cracking with emotion. I'm sad. I'm confused. I don't even know how to process any of this. Mitchell's heart ached as he listened, but he knew he couldn't push her. That's okay, he said softly, his voice gentle but firm. You don't have to have all the answers right now. You don't need to know everything at once. Just know that I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere. Emma met his gaze, her eyes filled with a mix of emotions she couldn't even name. There was a part of her that wanted to collapse into his arms, to accept the comfort he was offering. But another part, the part that had been hidden for so long, kept her at a distance. Though he was her father, he was still, in so many ways, a stranger. I need time, Emma finally said, her voice small and fragile. Mitchell nodded, understanding the weight of her words. Take all the time you need, he said, his voice full of empathy. I'm not going to push you. I just want you to know that I'll be here when you're ready. They sat in silence for a long while, the weight of everything between them pressing down like a suffocating fog. Emma wiped her eyes again, trying to pull herself together. As she glanced at the clock, she realized hours had passed since they started talking. It felt as if time itself had stood still. And yet it felt like everything was moving too fast. Mitchell stood, sensing that she needed space. I should probably let you rest, he said quietly. But if you need anything at all, just call me. I'll be here. Emma nodded, her eyes still swollen from crying. Okay. Mitchell hesitated for a moment, as though wanting to say something more but unsure what words could offer comfort. Finally he whispered, I love you, Emma, and left the room, the door closing softly behind him. Emma leaned back against the pillows, the heaviness in her chest making it hard to breathe. Her mind was spinning, trying to make sense of everything that had just been thrown at her. She had never felt so lost, so disoriented, as if she didn't even know who she was anymore. Her entire life had been taken from her in an instant, and now she was left to try to pick up the broken pieces. But amidst the pain and confusion, there was something else, a flicker of hope. Her father was here. He was offering her the truth, even if it was painful. And maybe, just maybe, they could find a way to heal together. Mitchell left the hospital, his heart heavy as he replayed the conversation with Emma in his mind. He had finally told her the truth, but seeing her reaction had been harder than he ever expected. The confusion, the pain, the shock on her face, those images would haunt him for a long time. He had spent years praying for this moment, dreaming of the day he would finally find his daughter. But now that it had happened, it felt like they had lost something even more. When he pulled into the driveway, Mitchell sat in the car for a few moments, gathering his thoughts. He wasn't ready to face Diane. Not yet. Not until he had processed everything that had happened. But deep down, he knew he couldn't avoid her forever. She had stolen Emma from him, and now it was time for her to face the consequences of her actions. The house was eerily quiet. The lights were dim, and there was no sign of Diane. A part of him felt a brief sense of relief. He needed time to think, to breathe. But another part of him, angrier now, more desperate for answers, wanted to confront her, to demand the truth. Mitchell walked into the living room, his hands trembling as he sat on the couch. His mind was racing with questions. What had driven Diane to do something so monstrous? Had she ever regretted it? And what was he supposed to do now? How could he live with her knowing what she had done? Before he could lose himself in his thoughts, he heard soft footsteps approaching. Diane appeared in the doorway, her face pale and drawn. The fear in her eyes was unmistakable. She had to know that the truth was out. "Mitchell," she said quietly, her voice shaky. "Can we talk?" Mitchell looked up at her, the anger that he had been trying to suppress rising to the surface. "Talk?" he repeated, his voice thick with emotion. "After everything you've done, now you want to talk?" Diane flinched at the sharpness of his words, but she didn't back down. "Please," she whispered, taking a tentative step toward him. "I know I've made mistakes. I know I've hurt you, hurt Emma. But I need you to understand that I never meant for it to go this far." Mitchell stood up abruptly, his heart pounding. "You never meant for it to go this far?" He was incredulous. "Diane, you took my daughter. You stole her away because you were jealous. And now you want me to understand?" Tears welled in Diane's eyes as she reached out toward him, but Mitchell stepped back, his hands clenching into fists. "I was scared," she sobbed, her voice broken. "I was scared that you would never love me the way you loved her. I was so desperate to make our life work. Happy." Mitchell's voice cracked with disbelief. "You thought I could be happy without my daughter? Do you know what you've done to us? To me? To Emma?" Diane's sobs grew louder as she sank to the floor, her face buried in her hands. "I know I've ruined everything," she cried. "I know you'll never forgive me. But please, Mitchell. I didn't want to lose you. I love you." Mitchell stood over her, his emotions a chaotic storm. The love she claimed to have for him felt hollow now, tainted by the unspeakable truth of what she had done. He stared at her, his heart heavy with the weight of her words. He wanted to feel something. Anger, pity, anything, but all he could feel was the unbearable pain of betrayal. Anger, hatred, even pity, Mitchell whispered, his voice tinged with disbelief. "But all I feel is emptiness." "Love," he continued, his words colder than ice. "You don't know what love is. If you loved me, you wouldn't have taken my daughter from me. You wouldn't have let me suffer all these years, believing she was gone forever." Diane's eyes, streaked with tears, met his. She trembled as she looked up at him. "I can't take it back," she whispered. "I know that. But I'm begging you. Please don't leave me. I'll do anything to make it right." Mitchell's heart ached with a rush of emotions he couldn't name. He had shared his life with this woman, built a family with her. Or so he thought. But now everything was shattered. The family he'd worked so hard to create had crumbled, and there was no putting it back together again. "I can't do this anymore," he said quietly, his voice filled with resignation. "I don't know who you are anymore. I don't know how you could do something so horrible and live with it all these years." Diane's sobs grew louder as the weight of his words sank in. She fell to her knees, crawling toward him. "Please," she begged, her voice pleading. "I'll get help. I'll do whatever it takes. Just don't leave me." But Mitchell knew it was over. The woman he once loved, the one who had once meant everything to him, was a stranger now. The betrayal was too deep. He shook his head, his eyes filled with sorrow. "It's too late," he said softly. "You've taken everything from me, Diane. The sobs echoed through the house as Mitchell turned and walked toward the door. He couldn't stay in this place any longer. Not with the memories of what they had lost, of everything that had been stolen from them. The cool night air hit him like a wave as he stepped outside, taking a deep breath, trying to steady himself. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing for certain. He had to find a way to move forward. For Emma's sake. She was the one who had suffered the most, and now more than ever she needed him. As Mitchell walked down the driveway, his thoughts turned to Emma. He had to help her heal. He had to guide her through the pain of what they both had lost. And though the road ahead would be difficult, he knew they could face it together. The days that followed were a blur. Mitchell's world had been upended. But amidst the chaos of everything that had happened, one thing remained clear: Emma. Despite the pain Diane's betrayal had caused, Mitchell knew that his future now rested on rebuilding his relationship with his daughter. It was the only way forward. He spent hours at the hospital, sitting by Emma's bedside, trying to bridge the 18-year gap between them. It wasn't easy. There were moments of awkwardness, moments where neither of them knew what to say. But slowly they started finding common ground. They talked about small things at first: her favorite books, his work at the hospital, the memories he had of her as a child. The conversations were tentative, but with each passing day, they grew more comfortable with each other. One afternoon, as the sun streamed through the window of her hospital room, Emma looked at Mitchell, her eyes a mixture of sadness and cautious hope. "Do you think we'll ever really know each other?" she asked softly, her fingers nervously fidgeting with the edge of her blanket. Mitchell's heart ached at the question. He had asked himself that very thing countless times in the past few days. 18 years was a long time, and the life they had lost couldn't be regained. But as he looked into her eyes, he knew one thing. He would spend the rest of his life trying. "We've missed a lot," Mitchell said gently. "But we have time now, Emma. We'll figure it out together." Emma was silent for a moment, her eyes downcast. Finally she nodded. "I hope so," she whispered. "It's just hard, you know? I feel like I've lost so much." Mitchell reached out and placed his hand over hers. "I know," he said softly, his heart breaking for her. "I'm so sorry for everything that's been taken from you. But I'm here now. And I'm not going anywhere." Emma looked up at him, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I want to believe that," she said quietly. "I do. But it's hard to trust again after everything." Mitchell nodded, his heart heavy with the weight of her words. "You don't have to trust me right away. Take your time. We'll go at your pace. Just know that I'm here for you. Always." For a moment they sat in silence, the weight of the past hanging between them. But in that silence there was something new. Something that hadn't been there before. It wasn't hope, at least not yet. But it was the beginning of something. The next few days passed slowly but steadily. Emma was discharged from the hospital, and Mitchell offered her a place to stay at his home. Though he knew it would be an adjustment for both of them, she had her own life, her own independence. Mitchell didn't want to push too hard. Emma accepted his offer, and together, they began the delicate process of navigating this new chapter of their lives. Their first few days living together were awkward. Mitchell wasn't sure how to act, whether to treat her like the adult she had become or the child he had lost. Emma, too, seemed unsure, caught between wanting to build a relationship with her father and still processing the trauma of everything she had been through. But despite the awkwardness, there were moments of connection. Small, fleeting moments that gave Mitchell hope. One evening, as they sat in the living room, the television playing softly in the background, Emma suddenly turned to him. "Do you ever think about what life would have been like if none of this had happened?" she asked, her voice quiet, contemplative. Emma's voice was soft when she spoke, as if testing the waters of a thought that had been swimming in her mind for a while. "Do you ever wonder what life would have been like if things had turned out differently?" Mitchell sighed, leaning back in his chair, the weight of her question pressing down on him. "All the time," he admitted, his voice thick with emotion. "I've thought about it every single day for the last 18 years. I used to imagine what you'd be like, what kind of person you'd grow into. And now seeing you here, knowing you're Emma, it's hard to wrap my mind around it." Emma nodded, her gaze distant as she processed his words. "I wonder too. Sometimes I think about how different I might have turned out if I hadn't been taken, if I had grown up with you instead of..." Her voice trailed off and Mitchell's heart clenched as he sensed the unspoken pain in her words. I think about that too, he said quietly, his voice filled with sadness. But the truth is we can't change the past. All we can do is focus on what we have now, on what we can build moving forward. Emma glanced at him, her face thoughtful as though weighing his words. Yeah, I guess you're right, she murmured. After a brief silence she added, I'm scared though. I'm scared that I'll never really feel normal again. That this will always be hanging over me. Mitchell's chest tightened at her vulnerability. He reached out and gently squeezed her hand, offering what comfort he could. You don't have to be okay right away, he said softly. This is a lot to process. It's going to take time, but we'll get through it together. One step at a time. Emma looked at him, her eyes filled with uncertainty, but also a flicker of hope. She nodded slowly, her voice quiet but sincere. I want that. I want to believe that we can make it work. In the days that followed, Mitchell began to notice subtle changes in Emma. She started to open up more, sharing pieces of her life, stories from her time in foster care, moments from her childhood, and even the dreams she had for her future. Mitchell listened, his heart swelling with pride for the woman she had become. Despite everything she'd been through, she was strong, resilient, and filled with hope for what lay ahead. The more time they spent together, the more Mitchell felt the weight of the past begin to lift. The pain of everything that had happened would never fully go away, but with each passing day, he and Emma were learning to move forward, to build something new out of the wreckage of their old lives. One evening as they sat on the porch, watching the last traces of sunlight fade over the horizon, Emma turned to him, a small smile playing at the corners of her lips. You know, she said quietly, I think we're going to be okay. Mitchell smiled back at her, the warmth in his chest spreading like sunlight after a storm. Yeah, he said softly, his voice filled with conviction. Think we are. For the first time in a long time, Mitchell truly believed it.